So here's an interesting story that our team at the Hindustan Times has been covering in America. Imagine an American lobbyist who once served as an ambassador for an armed Naga insurgency here in the United States, jetting off to secret meetings in Bangkok to meet that group's leadership and actively lobbying the US government to support Naga independence. It sounds like the plot of a bad spy drama, but interestingly, this is all real life. I'm talking about Grace Collins, a Korean-American activist who represented the Nationalist Socialist Council of Nagaland as its lobbyist in Washington between 2003 and 2011. Collins was advocating for Nagalim, a separate homeland for the Naga people independent of India. You've probably never heard about Collins, and with good reason, because she's not been an active registered lobbyist in the US for the last 14 years. But just a few months ago, as Hindustan Times reported, Collins has registered to lobby again on behalf of the Naga cause here in the United States. So who is Collins? Why is she fighting for an independent Naga homeland? And should India be worried? That's what we're going to talk about on this episode of HT Explained. So let's start with the basics of the story, who the main characters are. To understand Grace Collins, we need to understand who and what she's working for. For decades, Collins has been calling for the creation of Nagaland. Nagaland basically means Greater Nagaland. It is the proposed idea for a sovereign homeland for the Naga people, roughly 3 million people, mostly Christians. And this sovereign homeland is supposed to be carved out of the Indian state of Nagaland, Assam, Manipur, Arunachal Pradesh, as well as parts of Myanmar's Sagaing region. Now, in order to achieve this, Collins has worked for the Nationalist Socialist Council of Nagaland, which I'm going to call the NSCN moving forward. Now, Nagaland has seen an off-and-on insurgency since the 1950s, with Naga insurgent groups clashing with the Indian security forces. The NSCN was one of those groups that picked up arms against the Indian state. It was formed in 1980. But in 1997, it agreed to a ceasefire with the Indian government, and that ceasefire has held up for pretty much the last 29 years. That is where Grace Collins comes into the story. Collins is an American Christian activist of Korean descent who discovered the Naga cause because of her activism for Christian groups. Now, according to lobbying disclosures that Collins had to legally file with the US Department of Justice, she points out that she's been associated with the NSCN since the late 1990s. But in 2003, she formally registered to lobby in the United States as the ambassador of the People's Republic of Nagaland. To be clear, this is not a recognized ambassadorial title, but Collins worked closely with Isaac Chishiswu, who was none other than the former chairman of the NSCN-IM. It does not get more senior than that. And her job officially was to mobilize public opinion here in the United States on the peace talks that were going on between the Indian government and the NSCN. Now, in her lobbying disclosures, Collins states openly that her organization's vision was to fight for the independence of the Naga people from the Indian-occupied state of Nagaland. That was her words, not mine. And her job was also to try and get the US government interested in interfering in the Naga issue. It is the hope that the US will take an interest in the plight of the Nagas with respect to their conflict with India, she said in her first lobbying disclosure in 2003. Collins also hoped to create support for a US fact-finding mission to Nagaland and to also get US officials to come and observe peace talks between the Indian government and the NSCN. But why this focus on the US? Well, in her own words, the Nagas have and still revere Americans, especially the American Baptist missionaries who brought Christianity to them in 1837. Now, this is important because of Collins' background as a Christian activist. Over the next 8 years, between 2003 and 2011, Collins lobbied US politicians, particularly in Washington, D.C., on the Naga cause. She was trying to gather support for the NSCN and trying to condemn India's handling of the Naga issue, as well as alleged human rights violations in Nagaland. According to those disclosures that we at HT have seen, she met with some pretty reasonably influential people. One of them was Congressman Dan Burton, who founded the Pakistan caucus in the House of Representatives and was long seen as a critic of India. Collins also met with the offices of Congressman Chris Van Hollen, who now represents Maryland in the US Senate, also remains fairly critical of India. She also met with the offices of Gavin Newsom, who was then the mayor of San Francisco, is now the governor of California, and is very likely to run for president of the United States in 2028. Besides US politicians, she also tried to drum up increased support by reaching out to United Nations agencies, by sending them press packets on the Naga issues. She even tried to reach out to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. In addition to all of this, she also worked with a number of Christian activist groups by alleging that Christians in Nagaland were facing discrimination by the Indian state and tried to get those US groups involved in India's domestic politics. Now, disclosures also show that Collins was paid tens of thousands of dollars for her work by the NSCN. She also flew regularly to Thailand to meet with the leadership of the NSCN, which was based there at that point in time. However, despite all of this lobbying activity, it's not clear if Collins really had much success. The Naga issue then and now does not really seem to have a lot of traction here in the United States. In writing the story, I reached out to a number of officials, a number of people who track these things closely, and none of them had ever heard of Grace Collins. One reason for this might be that Collins hasn't been active as a lobbyist in the United States for the last 14 years. By 2011, she filed a disclosure saying that her association with the NSCN has ended. But she did not give up her activities on behalf of Naga groups. Scattered across the internet are mentions of her meetings with Christian groups and pro-Khalistan groups and condemning India's policies towards its minorities for years now. So she has remained a fairly active critic of India, meeting with Khalistani groups, meeting with Christian activist groups, even if she hasn't been a registered lobbyist. And that brings us to 2025, when Collins registered a lobby again on behalf of an organization called One Naga Voice. Now, this group claims to be a faith-based group. It does not stand for violence, but it still stands for the creation of Nagalim. Collins says in her lobbying disclosures that she intends to revive her activities between 2003 and 2011. And the timing of her return is interesting because over the last 2 years, we have seen several groups like the NSC and IM express a lot of dissatisfaction in their peace talks with India. In fact, in 2024, the NSCN actually threatened to end its 27-year ceasefire with the Indian government. Now, this struck us at the Hindustan Times as a very important story, and so we reached out to Collins to ask her about her activities, and she actually did respond. She says that her work on Naga and other human rights issues is independent and not directed or controlled by any faction, organization, or government. She also says that, and consistent with her past statements, Collins has criticized the Indian government's handling of issues related to Nagaland, including the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the anti-conversion laws that exist right now in India, as well as the UAPA. However, Collins says that she does not intend to advocate for any specific political outcomes for the Naga people. She said, and I quote, "I do not advocate political outcomes. Such decisions belong to the Naga people themselves. I report and analyze what the majority of Naga people have expressed as their aspirations for the future." So in the midst of all of these stories about India and Pakistan lobbying the Trump administration, we have this unexpected return of a long-forgotten player. How will this impact India-US relations? What exactly is Grace Collins going to be up to in America? And what will this mean for the peace talks between India and the NSCN? We'll be keeping a close track of this story and other stories here in Washington, D.C. for you. Thank you so much for watching the Hindustan Times with me, Shashank Mattoo. I'm the paper's America correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
$25 करोड़ गरीब गरीबी को परास्त करके बाहर निकले।
For the good of our nation, let's work together and let's truly make America great again.
The fastest news breaks.
Requested PM saying that we will have to speak to Putin and to Zelensky.
The biggest newsmakers.
The relationship with India is probably the most important bilateral relationship the U.S. will have for the rest of this century.
The capital delivered quite an election result today.
Expert analysis.
The million-dollar question today is how to stop this dance of death.
Ground reports.
I'm standing at the crossroad of the Kumbh Mela. Behind me are more than 100 entry ghats.
Long-form interviews.
Exclusionary politics is reflected in Manipur case as well. You don't bother because this is a small state.
Deep dive into burning issues.
It's often said DRC could be the richest country in the whole world. It's because of what sits underneath.
Why exactly did the US topple the Sheikh Hasina government?
HD videos. We don't just break news, we break it down.